Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I am your host. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to timestamp this a little bit. Today is Friday, November the 8th. Just got done with a full court day. As you know, this past Tuesday was an election. Regardless of who you supported on the national ticket or on the statewide ticket, I just want you to know that I've been reelected to my 5th term, which is kind of a big deal in state district judge parlance, because at the end of this term, I will have hit 20 years. That's kind of a magical number as it relates to retiring from this job. Although I do intend at some point to retire from this job, it absolutely will not be the end of my political career. I really enjoy the policy part of what I do. I feel like we've made tremendous steps in our county as it relates to a lot of different areas, from the magistration process to indigent defense, to how the judiciary operates and interacts with other parts of the infrastructure here in Bexar County. So I feel good about the work I've done. Know that I will definitely be on another ballot, but that's for another episode. I just want y'all to know that I'm feeling really good about my particular election results. Thank you if you have shown support for me, and if not, it's all good anyway. So I'm excited for this particular episode. Now, you know that I haven't really talked a whole lot about cases that I've been involved. This one is one where I actually presided over, and it was a really big case. Right before we started recording, I saw the 2 individuals that are with me in the studio today. I'm going to introduce each one of them. And after I introduce them, I want each one of them to tell us a little bit about themselves. And so we know exactly who we're talking to. And then we'll get into the meat of this case. The first person I'm going to introduce is a prosecutor who worked with me. Now I'm looking at her at this Zoom screen, so one wouldn't think that it's been a very long time ago, because I can see the aging process as I look at myself, but that doesn't always apply to others, and it certainly doesn't apply to you, Kirsta. Let me introduce Kirsta Melton. Kirsta, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Judge. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what's been going on in your life?
Absolutely. So I did spend 15 years as an assistant district attorney there in San Antonio, and it was an awesome period of time. I left at the end of 2014. I went to the Attorney General's office and started the human trafficking and transnational organized crime section there, and I ran that until the end of 2019. And then I left there to start Institute to Combat Trafficking, which is a small nonprofit that I use to help communities assess their vulnerabilities for trafficking and come up with solutions for that, as well as serving as a special assistant district attorney in cases where offices want me to assist on investigations and prosecutions of human trafficking. And our case today was the first human trafficking case tried in Bexar County, and one of the very first in the state. So I just want to put that out there.
Absolutely. And so just to kind of go back a little bit, you were a really, really good prosecutor, and you were already in the office when I first got elected.
Yes, sir.
And so I was fortunate to have you practice some in this court. Was Bexar County using the special unit back then that focused specifically on these types of cases?
Yes, we started the human trafficking unit in approximately, well, you know what? Not when this first case was tried. It got started in 2012, and our first case was tried in 2010. By the second time the second defendant in the Moreno brothers set of cases, then we were a unit.
And so then you were, because of your experience and energy and the heart that you put in these cases, you were the individual that actually started that particular process and then brought that unit into the fold. Is that right?
Correct.
Excellent. Excellent. And what law school did you go to?
I went to UT Law.
You're a Longhorn.
I am indeed.
You know, and a lot of people think that a good, tough prosecutor means adversarial, tough to work with. But I do remember this trial. I remember going through it. It was very high profile. A lot of media was there, and you were actually great to work with. You know, sometimes judges make those rulings, and you can see attorneys kind of pout at after the ruling or at the end of the day. I never saw that from either side on either of these two trials. Got to throw that out. The other special guest that we have, this is a three-way conversation. We have had some multiple conversations with folks on these in some of these episodes. Is another very, very special person. Let me introduce to you a young lady named Jessica Cantu. Jessica, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Yeah, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
My case obviously was, I guess, the first case tried in San Antonio. From then to now, I feel like I grew a lot more. I did tell Kirsta, I did want to thank you, Judge. There was one point when I was in TYC and I was at my lowest. I was having a lot of nightmares, and my nightmare has always been the same. It was him coming through my window, and I would always wake up right before where I felt like in my dream he was going to kill me. And I remember you mailed me a letter with their sentences and kind of told me, not to worry because they wouldn't be getting out. And I kept that letter for so many years because even after I got out, I would still struggle with nightmares and certain triggers. And I would always read that letter. And I had it for so many years, but somewhere when I was moving, it got lost. But I told Kirsta, I've always wanted to thank you because that letter would always help me, like when I was at my lowest. And it got me through a lot of my tough times. And, Kirsta has always been a support for me as well throughout these whole years. And I feel like she's been a big help to get me to where I am now. I'm able to talk about my case without without being scared or getting nervous or breaking down like I used to. I've gone through therapy and I still go to therapy, and that helps a lot. I feel like I'm in a much better place now to where Kirsta's been helping me with kind of getting into contact with people. I want to help girls and boys that have been in my situation and let them know that there is light at the end. Because I know for so many years I felt like it wasn't going to get better. There was no good in the end. But I'm doing a lot better. And now I want to help girls and boys that have gone through what I've been through and let them know that everything will be okay in the end.
That is great to hear. You and I actually have not spoken to each other since that trial. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I appreciate you telling me the things that you've told me. It really does mean a lot to me. And your case is one of those cases that anybody who's gone through that process can never forget. And so we have your permission to basically talk about this case and kind of go through it and recount some of the experience.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for allowing us to do that. And thank you for allowing us to educate the public about some of these things. You were the victim in these two cases. You were the subject. The state was bringing forth charges against these two defendants. This case is a case involving the Moreno brothers, Bobby and Juan Moreno. Let's kind of go into the background a little bit. Let's first talk about the facts. Let's talk about what happened in this case.
This was a case that I think really shocked the conscience of San Antonio and very first introduced them to the concept of human trafficking. And I want to say, Judge, when we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about the exploitation of men, women, and children for forced labor or forced sex by a third party for their own profit or gain. And that's exactly what the Moreno brothers were engaged in. And a lot of times, human trafficking gets mixed up with all sorts of political topics. It gets smushed in with smuggling and immigration. But human trafficking is a crime that is occurring in San Antonio to U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens. And Jessica's experience was a perfect example of that.
I was going to say something about that, right? A lot of folks, when this case was tried, And subsequent to that, they always reference human smuggling. And I do have the actual statute of the definition that existed at that time, because this case was tried. I think we tried it in 2012.
We tried it first in 2010, and then the second, Juan Moreno was 2010, Bobby Moreno was 2012.
So I was still a newer judge back then, right?
Yes.
I got elected in 2008, took office January the 1st of 2009. And so because this is a case that occurred, the actual actions, the actual crime occurred in 2007. Back then, 2007 had a certain statute that defined human trafficking. I think 2009 and 2011, the legislature introduced amendments to that, but we still had to use the 2009 laws because that is what was in place when this occurred. And so I pulled the human trafficking statute, and basically, in part, it reads as follows. A person commits an offense if the person, number one, knowingly traffics another person with the intent or knowledge that the trafficked person will engage in forced labor or services, or number two, intentionally or knowingly benefits from participating in a venture that involves an activity described by subdivision 1, including by receiving labor or services the person knows are forced labor or services. So that's the statute that you will work. This is not a human smuggling situation. This has nothing to do with crossing borders or anything like that.
Correct. It's forced sex or forced labor.
Mm-hmm.
And that remains true now with the changes that have occurred over the past 4 or 5 sessions. So the way that Jessica's case came to people's attention was that she had been on juvenile probation, and there came a period of time where she was not reporting, and her mom had reported her as missing. And so it was known generally that she was not where she was supposed to be. And there was a lot of concern from her family about that. And eventually she got picked up by probation, and it was a probation officer that's still there today who sat down with her and first asked her a series of questions, and out came the story about what happened to her. And what the problem at the time, Judge, was that nobody recognized human trafficking. They didn't understand what it was. It had only really become a federal law back in 2003. So this was not something that people were using to prosecute very often. And so what ended up happening is there was a significant delay of almost 2/3 of a year before there was any investigation into the case. And during that time, Jessica was in and out of juvenile probation and different juvenile detention facilities. And the probation officer that initially talked to her continued to try to pursue the case.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting concept, right? Because that was part of the issue here. It wasn't reported immediately. And we can talk a little bit about that. And Jessica, you were young at that time. How old were you at that particular time? You were 13,
I was like
12?
Yeah, 12, 13 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. So the idea that a child is missing at the age of 12 or 13, you would think that would be something that would be reported immediately. But here, whether or not it was reported immediately, the police actually didn't get involved in that for quite a while. And that probably presented some difficulties in how you tried that case, Kirsta. Is that about right?
Certainly. The delay in the investigation is never a positive thing. Whenever you have that, you lose evidence. And in this particular case, we actually lost some people, which kind of made it tough. So when I talk about this case, when I train on human trafficking, I'll just share the summary I give about it, which is that there was a young girl who was about 13 years old. She was the second of 4 kids. She lived mostly with her mom, but she still had her dad in her life. And sometimes she would go to school and sometimes she did not go to school. And on a particular day that she didn't go to school, she went down to the corner store and she picked up a lady that she knew there named Flor. And the two of them walked a couple of blocks in the neighborhood to a house where they knew that they could purchase some drugs. At this house was owned by the Moreno brothers. It had been passed down from their father. One of the guys lived there full time. That was Bobby. Juan actually had another house where he had a wife and child and a job. And so he would really just come to this house for drugs and drinking and fighting and whatever else was going on.
This was on the east side of San Antonio?
Yes. So on that particular day, Jessica and Floyd went in and they bought some drugs. And at some point, Jessica needed to use the bathroom in the house. And so they took her up to the front of of the house where there was a room that passed for a bathroom. And I say pass for a bathroom because this house was kind of falling down. The front porch was falling down. The side porch was falling down. It was kind of held together with a little bit of, and on the inside, right, there wasn't running water. There were Home Depot drums that they would fill with water to slosh sewage down the toilets. Some rooms had doors, some didn't. Some looked like they were being torn down. Others had some furniture in them and looked like they were living in those rooms. So they locked her in that room. And then they got rid of Flor. They told her, hey, look, you need to go. We've got stuff to do. And so Flor's like, well, where's Jessica? And they said, oh, she's gone back to the corner store. Just go.
And Flor was a friend of that.
Yes.
Friend from the neighborhood, an older lady.
Correct. And so she went back to the corner store and she looked for Jessica and she couldn't find her. And she came back to ask the Moreno brothers again. And they ran her off and just said, get out of here. We don't know where she is. And about an hour to an hour and a half passed. And at that time, they opened the door. They physically grabbed Jessica and they dragged her across the hallway to a room where they had a bed. And both brothers raped her. And then they decided that they would keep her and they would sell her to anyone who had extra money after they bought drugs.
And from the evidence, I think Bobby had sexually assaulted her, then held her down, which he was also charged with his brother Juan then.
Right. And that was the super aggravated sexual assault of a child under the age of 14.
Which was also a newer statute.
It was. And that was, at that time, that was the strongest statute that we had available because the trafficking at that time was only a second-degree felony and it was a non-3G, so non-parole. Quarter time for purposes of parole.
And then the super aggravated meant that it was
life without parole. So they decided that they would keep her and they would sell her to anyone who had money after they bought drugs, because that's what they were doing. They were using the house to sell drugs. And so people would come in, they would buy drugs, and then they would pay an additional fee to rape Jessica. And they kept Jessica tied up. They injected Jessica with drugs to keep her docile and to keep her from being able to fight back. And there were up to 20 different guys, some of them repeat buyers, who came over the next week and a half to 2 weeks and engaged in purchasing sex from a child who was laid out on that bed by these two men.
And my memory at that time is that she was on a bed. She wasn't able to use the facilities as it relates to bathroom facilities. So she was defecating and urinating on the bed. So these gentlemen, I'm using the term loosely, obviously, would come in and they weren't concerned about the conditions. They were just buying from a drug dealer, paying $25, and then having their way while Jessica was drugged out.
Correct.
And it was a forced injection of the heroin.
Absolutely. Eventually, what happened is that there came a day when Jessica was allowed up from the bed and she was dressed in like some of their clothes, men's clothing. And a guy from the neighborhood who knew her named Bobby saw that something was very, very wrong. He knew the Moreno brothers. He knew that she should not be at the Moreno brothers' house.
So outside the house?
Correct. She was like out on the porch area.
Mm-hmm. And I think that happened because there was some sort of government employee that was doing some sort of home visit. And as a result of that, they had to let Jessica off that bed and allow her to roam for just a bit.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But that person had left. And so Bobby realized that something bad was going on. He was offered the same opportunity that these other guys were, but he refused essentially to take it. He pretended that he would take it, had the opportunity to talk to Jessica and told her he was going to get her out, and eventually had her ask one of the brothers if she could go close the gate. One of the other brother had gone up the street to do something else. And that was the moment when he grabbed her and physically ran her from the location. And he took her to some of his family who fed her, who gave her a shower, who let her use their phone. And were able to see kind of the state of her hair, the fact that there were ligature marks, the state of the clothing, all of those things that indicated that she had been through an extremely traumatic event. And so then it was still some time before she ended up being picked up by probation. And I think about a week to 2 weeks. And that's when she sat down with Eliseo Mata. And Eliseo Mata asked her, hey, where you been? And out came the story. Eliseo took it incredibly seriously, wrote down everything she had to say, actually put her in a car, had her direct him to the location so he could see the house. It matched the details that she had given. And Eliseo started at that time trying to pursue law enforcement to investigate the case. And it ended up taking months of time before what ended up happening, Judge, is that the Bexar County Sheriff's Office got some training on human trafficking. They had a conversation with Eliseo at the Crimes Against Children conference, and they realized that this was a trafficking case, and they said, we will do something about it. And they came back and investigated the case. Now, during this time, Jessica was going through a whole lot of things, and I think she would be the best person really to talk about all the things that she was going through after the recovery.
Yes. So, Jessica, you just heard Kirsta recount the series of events. You were chained to a bed for 2 weeks. Do you recall that? And, I really don't necessarily want to get into so much of that, but is that something that you vividly remember and as it relates to everything that happened to you?
Yeah. When it happened, it was hard. I would have nightmares all the time. I would wake up screaming and crying. I was scared to go to sleep. I would fight my sleep because I didn't want to go to sleep. I was cutting a lot. They got to the point where I had cut up most of my body to where I had to start cutting on my face, on like just every part of my body. And the cutting, for me, I know a lot of people don't understand it, but for me, I felt like even in the shower, when I would shower, I would scrub my body so hard because it was like I felt like I just wanted to not feel like I felt disgusted with like myself and with my body because it's like even though it had already happened, I could like certain things would remind me of it to where I still felt it, and I would scrub my body so hard thinking like if I basically scrub my skin off or it takes it away. I tried to kill myself plenty of times. I turned to like smoking a lot because I felt like that helped me kind of, I guess, like not think about it or just kind of forget it.
Mm-hmm.
And for so many years, I didn't talk about it. I think the first time I actually talked about it, because every time I would go to therapy, I didn't like it. I guess I didn't feel that connection with like the therapists that were given to me. So I always for so long held it in. I think the first time I actually talked about it was when we did the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard doing it, but the only reason I did it and the only reason I kind of not forced myself to talk about it, but the only thing that was going through my head was I don't want it to happen to nobody. And that was my first time talking about it, like actually openly talking about it since it had happened.
How long had it been between the trial because I know that it took a long time from the actual event, the actual offense happening 2007 until 2010 was the first trial. How long was it after that 2012 second trial did y'all do that documentary? Because I know that I was contacted, but I was a sitting judge back then, and I was a little concerned about the things that I could or could not say.
Yeah, it was 2017 when we were doing the documentary. It came out in 2018, and it's still available as a human trafficking training now. It's called Be the One in the Fight Against Trafficking.
Y'all use that documentary as a training tool with the Texas Attorney General's office.
That's
is that right?
Correct. In fact, it's been viewed all over the world.
Incredible. And so kind of going through that experience, Jessica, I know that you were already involved in the juvenile system and some of the things that we deal with when we talk about victims, child victims of sex cases, of trafficking cases, they generally come from areas of the community where maybe they're more vulnerable, feel like they could maybe get away with it a little easier. Was your background sort of did it kind of fall into that category?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You were already using drugs at the age that you were at, which is what made you susceptible to this type of a kidnapping and harboring, and then these acts being perpetrated against. So, looking back, is there anything that you feel that could have been done differently since you were in the system that could have helped you, or is that just something that is way beyond? How can you stop two people that are committing such evil actions to actually do those things? What's your perception of that looking back?
I honestly feel juvenile system helped me a lot more than me going to therapy or me. I know this probably sounds weird, but around that time, I felt safer in detention because I kind of basically grew up there. I know that sounds bad, but at that time, I was always in and out of detention. I was real close with a lot of the staff, and they played a big part of helping me get past it. Because when I would wake up from my nightmares, Brenda worked transportation, which she was one of the officers that sat with me through the trial, her and my old probation officer, Melissa. As a transport officer, all you do is transport. But with Brenda, it was more like she stayed with me even after, like, to make sure I was okay, made sure I was fine before she left. And there was another staff, her name was Shamanica. And since I was on suicide watch, I would sleep in the day area because staff would have to monitor me. When I would wake up from my nightmares or I would wake up crying, she was right there every time, past her shift, just to make sure I was okay. When I would get all my anger, and I would get so much anger sometimes where I would assault staff. Me and Shamanica found a way to where she would put a mattress up in one of the rooms, and she would just let me scream in there, just let me punch the mattress, like just let me take all my anger out. And that helped me a lot because I didn't know how to let that anger out. I didn't want to talk about it. I felt like no one understood me. Like, so it was hard. And she's like, whatever you want to do, she's like, you could kick, scream, punch the mattress, get it out. And she would stay there with me even after she was clocked out. When I would wake up from my nightmare screaming, she was always right there every single time. They helped me more than my own family did. Like my mom understood it, but she blamed herself a lot. So I didn't like talking to her about it because I felt like when I would talk to her, she would blame herself. And my dad, he blamed himself too a lot for it. I felt like I couldn't talk to him about it. When it came to detention, like I said, they were the main ones that helped me get through it. Kirsta too, even after the case, was prosecuted, still to this day, when I feel like I need someone to talk to, I can call her every time, and she answers every time. Still till this day, like I still speak with Melissa and Brenda. I'm actually meeting with them next week for lunch, and anytime I need them, they're just like Kirsta. They always tell me I'm a call away. You can call me whenever.
So the detention officers at juvenile really went above and beyond. And Kirsta, as the prosecutor in this case, clearly did the same. You had that kind of support. That's a really positive statement as it relates to the system, because folks, I think, generally have this idea that detention centers, the detention system, it works and operates a certain way. The juvenile detention, without making any commentary as to how they operate, the idea is supposed to be one of rehabilitate juveniles, try to put them on a clear path. It's a different concept than what adult detention center is supposed to be, at least the way the law is written. So it almost sounds like you're telling me that, in your case, considering everything that you went through, that they really were a good support system.
Very.
Well, I'm enjoying this conversation so far. Let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome to the Q&A break. I'm here talking to Kirsta and Jessica. We have a question. Why aren't children allowed in courtrooms? That's a difficult question. Kirsta, do you have any thoughts about that?
Unfortunately, children are often victims of horrific crime. And we have an adversarial system. And what that means is that our law is set up under the theory that truth comes out when truth is challenged by advocates on both sides. And that's your lawyers on both sides. And so confrontation is at the heart of an adversarial system. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said that defendants who are being prosecuted for a crime have a right to confront the witnesses against them. So when a prosecutor has a case where you have a child victim, if I cannot prove all the elements of that offense without that child victim, then I'm going to have to put that child on to prove up whatever elements are required by that particular offense. And the judge made a good point when we were talking on a break, which is that sometimes kids are so young that they are not competent to testify. They cannot tell the difference between a truth and a lie. But if a child is able to narrate and a child is able to tell the difference between a truth and a lie, and they are a necessary witness, and it is not deemed to be a case that is so traumatizing that that there are certain provisions that allow for in-camera confrontation separate and apart from the courtroom, but those are extremely limited. Those are very, very limited cases. So the norm is that victims have to testify to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and the reference you're making about the competency issue, and you're right. During that conversation, we kind of threw out 4 years of age and younger tends to be that age where do they really understand? That's an issue, right? Does somebody have the understanding of the nature of the proceedings? Do they know the role of the court, the judge? Do they know what the attorneys are doing? One of the things that I always ask when a very young person comes in to testify as a witness or as a victim of a crime, I ask them, how old are you? Where do you go to school? What's your name? Get a little bit of qualifying information from them. On an occasion, I've done things like, the difference between what a truth and a lie is, right? If I tell you, I'm wearing a brown shirt when I'm really wearing a white shirt and I point to my shirt, is that a truth or is that a lie? And if they say, that's a lie, you ask little basic questions like that a jury can tell. I'll raise up my arm and I'll show my watch and I'll say, am I wearing a watch? And I'll point to it. Or if I tell you I am not wearing a watch, would that be a truth or a lie? And then you wait for the response. So you want to make sure that the child victims and witnesses can understand the nature of the proceedings. And it's up to the judge to make that determination, to decide whether or not this particular child can testify. As it relates to children in the courtroom who are not a part of the proceedings, sometimes I've known judges to say, we're not going to allow children in the courtroom. And generally it tends to be because maybe topics could be possibly traumatic to children. Maybe children are very young. They could be disruptive. We've had folks walk into the courtroom with infants or very young children that cry out or want to be fed or need parents' attention. So there are moments when judges can say, hey, this is disruptive to the court proceedings and we don't want that child in the courtroom at that time. You certainly always want to make sure that we protect children from any unnecessary trauma in the courtroom. And it's just never advisable to bring in young children. I do like to bring in high school students who are aware of the nature of the cases that we have as observers, just so they can learn about the system. We don't teach civics much anymore in the school system. So it's an opportunity to educate. So any chance we can to educate in the system. I think judges tend to be okay with that. But as it relates to just witnesses that are too young, sometimes judges are considering the nature of the proceedings. What about you, Jessica? You have any thoughts about that?
No, I've always wondered the same thing too. Why couldn't kids go in courtrooms?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. We get great questions on Beyond the Gavel. So thank you for submitting those questions. Keep those questions coming. Head over to beyondthegavelpodcast.com to send in any questions that you might have. Now let's get back into the show.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here talking with Kirsta and Jessica. So both of you, Jessica, we'll focus on you first. You made this transition from being a victim of this horrific crime to becoming an advocate, becoming somebody who is focused on working to help others and working to highlight and educate these types of issues with the public. What is it that allowed you to get into that sort of advocacy? How was it that you got started doing that?
I would say I think the best thing for me was leaving San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I left San Antonio and went to Dallas, that was like a fresh start for me. I started therapy.
Is this something that happened immediately after the case? Because I think you ended up going back into the system at some point, right? What was it? What was it that happened to you after the trial? I'm not familiar with it, so.
I was in and out of detention still. I think the first case, I was still kind of in and out. By the second case, they had already committed me to the Texas Youth Commission.
Mm-hmm.
I was there up until I was 19.
Mm-hmm.
So I got released the day before my 19th birthday. When I got out, I had actually went back to some old friends, got into some trouble, which I was lucky enough that one of the guys took the blame for it. So they let like all of us go. And somehow Kirsta found out about it. And her, Melissa, and Brenda, in kind of detention, found me, I wouldn't know what to call it.
Under an anti-trafficking program in Alabama. And she was there for a period of time, but then left that, kind of fell back into the cycle of not great behavior and not great for her behavior. And it was years, Judge. I mean, it was quite a few years before she made the move to Dallas and began kind of building a whole entire new life from there. So it was after the documentary, right, Jessica? So, I mean, it was after 2018.
Well, there was a federal grant then that existed to help victims of human trafficking, and you were able to use those grants in a way to specifically help Jessica in this case?
We did not have access to federal grants. There was some crime victims compensation money that assisted with at least some.
And that's in Austin, right? There's
some of the move, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, really, what I have seen is that the life that Jessica has built in Dallas is one of hard work, community, holding herself accountable. Like she talked about, when she was in forced therapy, not much came of that. But when she chose to go to therapy, I think it's a different story. Would you agree with that, Jessica?
Yes.
That's always been a criticism of the justice system, that you have victims that have these crimes perpetrated against them. They go through the system, jury trials like this one, post-jury trials. What happens to those victims of crime? Who is it? If it wasn't for you, Kirsta, who took this personal interest in Jessica. And I do remember in the trial, you got a little emotional at times, and you and I have had conversations about this case. And I was really proud, and I'll say it here. I was really proud of the fact that you headed and started that trafficking unit with the Texas Attorney General's office. I couldn't think of a better person who should do that or who could do that. But this has always been a big part of your life. Since this trial, at least, you have a big heart. You have a lot of compassion. If there was not a Kirsta Melton there and these other two detention officers there for a Jessica Cantu, what would have happened? What would have been the result of that?
Well, I think my belief, Judge, is that God would have raised up other people in her life, because Jessica matters to God and because he has a purpose and a plan for her life. So I think we were the people that God used in that space in that time. But I believe that God would have raised up others to support her. There are a lack of services. We're growing in that for trafficking victims, but there is certainly a lack of
resources.
Of resources, and also kind of an understanding that it is a journey and it is an individual journey and it is a long journey. And so going to a residential treatment, going to a residential program for a couple of years may be great, but 2 years, then you're out and you've got life to live. And so there is that need for a community to come around our victims of trafficking to help them live life in the way that they are intended to live life, and to support them. And a lot of kids, particularly who are victims of trafficking, don't have the support systems that they need to help chart that path. I mean, I think about my kids. We helped our kids so many, and I'm sure your kids as well, so many ways, kind of helping them figure out where they should go and what they should do and help facilitate the steps along that way. I mean, just think about trying to fill out the FAFSA, Judge, on your own. Like, that's a crazy thing. That's pretty much an undoable thing.
And they pretty much make it now to where kids can't do it on their own.
Right.
It requires family and parents.
It requires adults. And I've had trafficking victims who are like, you know what? My parents refuse to have any input. So I can't fill out this form. I mean, there's just little things like that we take for granted that I think a lot of times victims of trafficking are having to navigate entirely on their own. How to interview for jobs, life skills that they didn't necessarily have people giving to them in the way that other people have had given to them. They've had to earn it themselves. And I think Jessica has done that. And relationally, she has made incredible steps and investments in others, repay what investments people have made in her.
I just got done spending an entire day in the mental health court that I run on the felony court side. We had docket this morning and this afternoon. It is a Friday, as I mentioned earlier in this episode. But kind of thinking about it, victims of crime, particularly child victims of crime, have special issues that are going to develop in their life, specifically as a result of being victimized in the ways that they have in their lives, going through the trial process and everything else. Maybe we can develop some sort of specialty court for those defendants that can specifically relate to their issues going back to the fact that they were victimized in the way that they were. There does need to be some attention and focus on these child victims of crime because they are going to require, and I'm sure, Jessica, you can attest to this, basically a lifetime of support and services and recognizing that there's nothing that you did. There's nothing that you were at fault for. You truly just were a random victim of crime. We need to make sure that your life turns out to be something where at least you could find some sort of happiness in your life. Is that kind of what you're looking at? You're trying to kind of, with the advocacy that you've been doing, you're kind of trying to find that for others that maybe have gone through what you've gone through?
Except I had a lot of anger and that I didn't know how to let out or how to release my anger because at the time I wasn't doing therapy. I didn't want to do therapy. So I guess for me, that's the only bad thing I can say about the juvenile system is the forced therapy is what I did not like. Making me talk to somebody versus instead of letting me just kind of ease into it, it was more of a, no, you're going to therapy to specifically talk about this. And I didn't want to talk about it. So I didn't talk about it. I would talk about it with like the staff that I was comfortable with, like when I would have my nightmares and stuff. But I guess for me, that was what always pushed me away from therapy for so many years it was always, okay, well, this happened. So let's start talking about this. And I'm like, why can't we just like slowly get there? Why Like, I don't even know you and you want me to tell you everything that happened. So that was the only thing for me. So that caused a lot of anger that I didn't know how to release it. So my way of releasing it was assaulting staff. And because I feel like if I would have got out on monitor or, just released because of my age, I really feel like I'd be dead or in jail right now. I don't feel like I would be where I am right now.
But you've made an incredible transition.
Thank you.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about the trial. It was very high profile. Cameras were in the courtroom. Still early in my judicial career. What was it like for you to try a case like the case of first impression in Bexar County? Our Court of Appeals hadn't seen anything like it yet. Trial courts hadn't seen anything like it. Yeah. What was all that like for you?
Doing it first, Judge, that means you make all your own mistakes and you better catch all your own mistakes. So I was in trial the week before that trial in the 399. So I went back to back into this case. I was lucky enough to have Mary Green sit with me in Jessica's case.
Fabulous prosecutor.
Yeah.
Awesome prosecutor.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And so she had done some of the punishment. We had found a punishment witness, and this was Juan Moreno's biological daughter, who he had abused sexually as well. And so Mary had prepped her up while I was in trial the week before in another court. And we got ready. But our trial was super simple. Like, this was not a case that had DNA. It was not a case that had forensic evidence of any kind. So if you remember, the case occurred like December, January. It was not investigated until October, November. By that time, Flor, the lady that Jessica had gone to the Moreno brothers' house with, had died. Bobby Ojeda, who ended up being the person who ran her out of there, he had picked up a felony charge, and so he had a felony burglary at that time. Lots of time passed for the witnesses in terms of, like, no one had given a statement until October and November. So law enforcement was doing their absolute best with a scene that had changed. The brothers were no longer living in the house. The house didn't look the same internally. And so they photographed the house. They photographed the 6-foot marijuana plants grown in the backyard. They did interior and exterior photos, but that was the extent of the evidence, as in the way that people think of evidence, right? So I know that you've experienced this, Judge. When we say evidence, we mean testimony, because that is the bulk of evidence that comes in every trial.
Yeah, and a lot of folks don't get that, right? A lot of people think, and I remember when I was a defense attorney, people would say, they can't try this case. They can't prove this case. They have no evidence. Yeah, that's a big thing. They have no, and you got to explain to them, testimony is evidence. And it's up to a jury to believe those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And they can believe it from listening to one person that they completely believe, that they think proved each of those elements. And then all the evidence is complete. That can happen.
So in our case, this was going to be a testimonial case. So we put on, and pretty much the same in both trials. So Jessica came over in her detention garb, and her detention guard sat on the front row of that trial because she was coming directly from detention. We put on the probation officer, Eliseo Mata, who had first talked to her. But he was really obviously not able to tell what she had said. He was mostly able to talk about kind of her state of mind and also what he had done in terms of trying to pursue an investigation. We put on the original detective who had done the interviews, and Jessica originally had not identified Juan Moreno from the lineup. She had identified Bobby, but she was too scared to identify Juan. And she told law enforcement that basically, that was why she didn't pick him out. Juan was the one who had threatened her and threatened her family. And so she very much was, even though Spider, Bobby, was the one with the tats and who the teardrop and who looked, scarier. Juan was the one who really left the impression on her. And so there was that concern within the investigation. And so that detective was able to talk about what they had done, who they had interviewed. We put on the photographs of the house. And then
the house looked very severely neglected.
It did. But if you remember, there were gates with bars and a do not enter or beware of dog sign with chains. Even though there was no dog there and nothing of value other than the drugs throwing in the backyard. So we put on Jessica's mom because we really wanted someone to talk about loving Jessica and being very worried and scared when she was gone. And then we put on Jessica, and Jessica was as honest as the day is long and just told it how it was. And we decided that we would not try to eliminate out anything. We just told it how it was. And she talked about kind of why she had been on juvenile probation. She told her story, and then she told the story of what happened that day.
So whatever you say, eliminate out, what you're talking about is trying to ask the judge to not allow certain evidence to come in before approaching, asking the judge, making sure that it's a relevant issue, because theoretically her background is something that would be used against her, right? You've been in custody, you've been arrested as far as the juvenile system goes. And so therefore, maybe you're not as credible. You've been using drugs, right. You're not as credible, right? So rather than do what is not uncommon of trying to get that stuff out, you said, let it all come in. Let Jessica be Jessica.
We did.
And let the jury see that and determine then what it is that they're going to believe.
And so Jessica got through direct very well. And
I remember
she
that.
answered the questions and she did just fine. Mm-hmm. And then we got to cross-examination. And the cross-examination was actually very low-key, very gentle in terms of the crosses that you've seen over the course of your time, I'm sure, on the bench, and certainly in my time as a prosecutor. I didn't feel there were very few objections. It was a very quiet cross and a very pleasant cross overall. However, he started ticking her off, right? Because he started asking about things that were different in the multiple statements that she had given. So she had given a statement to LSM. She had given a statement to the detective. She had now testified. And of course, there were differences in those because different questions were asked. They were in different contexts. You're having a conversation with a different person. So he was picking at those. And when I say picking, that's exactly what I mean. It's like your little brother in the car next to you, like poking you. And Jessica started to get ticked off. So at one point, Judge, she folded, and that's the thing. So she went from kind of sitting there normally to she folded those arms, she hunched down, and she at one point said, I don't want to answer any more of your questions. At another point, she's like, you're pissing me off. I had to ask for a couple of breaks. After the you're pissing me off, I'm like, we need a break. So I pulled her out into the hallway. And I was right up in her face, and I'm just like, hey, do you want to help me or do you want to help him? And she's like, you? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay. Then I need you to go back in there. I need you to sit up straight, listen to the question, and answer it truthfully. That's what you got to do here. And so she's like, okay. So she...
I remember that. There was like a gasp in the courtroom. The cameras were on.
After she said she's
absolutely,
him, and I'm like, whoa, we don't do that.
But it was still a good move for you to let her be herself, because Absolutely. It showed a child victim. It's such a horrific idea that a child victim could go through that. What do you expect the testimony to be like? How do you expect a child who's been through that, who's being questioned? I cannot even remember a story that I told from this morning. How can you remember the exact same way that you're going to recount? Exactly. You're being interviewed over and over and over and over again. It makes sense that a victim in that situation could get frustrated with the process. And then to be in a jury trial, seeing cameras in the back, knowing that this thing is being recorded, knowing that there's 12 people, knowing that there's a gentleman next to you who is wearing the black robe, who's trying not to show any emotion. Attorneys at the bench, court reporter, the whole scene. What is that like for a child victim to have to go through? We have to consider those things. when we try those things.
We do, but I will tell you that in my career as a prosecutor, that overall kids tell the truth and are more open and honest than grown-ups ever are on the stand. And kids want justice. I had talked to Jessica about that. Never once did she say, I don't care what happens. She said, no, they deserve consequences. Even in between trials, when there were problems and she cut her monitor and all sorts of mess was going on, she wanted accountability for what they did. And so she was willing to go through the process. And I'm super proud of her. And my trafficking victims have always been willing to do that, in large part for the exact same reason that Jessica said, which is, I don't want it to ever happen to anybody else. I don't want them to hurt anyone else. So I will do this. So she went back in, Judge. All of a sudden, her posture changed entirely. She sat up, head pops up. He starts picking at her again on the difference in the statement. At one point, he's like, your statement says that you were spread eagle. Do you even know what that word means? And she's like, I don't. He goes, so who put that word? And she said, the detective did, because the word I used was a lot uglier. And that shut him down. It shut down the cross. There were very few questions afterwards. She was done. She was paying attention. She was answering precisely. And he finished. We put on a couple of the Bobbies. We put on Bobby, who was willing to testify despite the fact that he had felony charges pending. He came and testified. And he talked about the fact that it didn't matter to him. You know, Mary Green asked him, she said, why did you do this? And he said, no kid should ever be in that position. He goes, I wasn't going to leave her there. And that was just it. Like, it was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it happen to her. And so he cared enough about her, just having known her from around the neighborhood and seeing her here and there, you know, he cared enough to basically risk his life, put himself on the line for her. And that testimony was incredibly powerful. And then finally, Dr. Kellogg testified about the fact that she had contracted a sexually transmitted disease. She talked about trauma. She talked about many of the things that Jessica had gone through. She revealed to the jury that Jessica had been pregnant, going through this repeated rape and abuse. And that was just, there was just an honesty about it. And that jury came back in less than 2 hours with a guilty verdict.
And I believe it was Bobby Moreno Spider. I was sentencing him. The jury sentenced him on one of the, I think it was the super ag sex of the child. They gave him life.
Okay, well, in Juan's case, that first trial, they gave life across the board for all offenses, and life without parole. So all 4 offenses, they gave life sentences, and then the super ag was life without parole. In Bobby's case, they gave life without parole on the super ag. And then they gave a series of sentences at like 50, 45, 60, somewhere in there for each of the other offenses. But it didn't matter because the life without parole was the end deal.
I do recall I was about to sentence him. Maybe it was the second trial. I was about to sentence him in accordance with what the jury was assessing. And the interesting thing, people are always asking me, you know, have you gone against, you know, have you ever sentenced somebody differently than the sentence that a jury imposes? If a jury says guilty, can you come back and say not guilty? If a jury, and the answer is no. Once you get to that point, what the jury says is the verdict, is the sentence, and the responsibility of the judge is to make sure that it was a unanimous verdict. And that's based, if it's a unanimous verdict, then the judge accepts the verdict. Sometimes people have told me, you know, oh, you agree with the jury's verdict. And my response is always, I don't have the right to say I agree or disagree. They're the jury. They make that decision. They followed the law. They followed the instructions. But when I accept the verdict, it means that I'm telling them it's a good verdict as it relates to the law has been followed. The process has been followed. There's, you know, all 12 of them agree. You know, that's why we ask questions like, you know, do you want us to to poll the jury, make sure that each individual verdict is in conformity with the overall verdict. But the one thing before I sentenced, I believe it was Bobby, and this I'll never forget. And the cameras are on me, right? So I'm cognizant of that. He asked me, I got one question, Your Honor. And I'm like, yes. Will these sentences be run concurrent? And in the back of my mind, we're thinking, well, he's got that life sentence without parole. So it really doesn't matter. But I remember my instantaneous response was, yes, because the law says that they must. And he was happy with that. He walked out with a smile on his face thinking, I got these sentences run concurrent.
Yeah, now you would be able to stack the human trafficking and the compelling on one another, but you couldn't at the time under the law. I think the jury in the first case was incredibly moved both by Jessica's testimony and the testimony of Juan Moreno's daughter. And we spent an hour plus with them after that trial, Judge. The prosecution, we sat with them for a long time. And at the end of that time, they said, hey, are you going to see Jessica? And I said, yes, we have another brother to try. We have buyers. I will see her. And they said, will you tell her that we gave life because she was worth it? I've never had a jury tell me anything like that. And I love that as someone who prosecutes human trafficking and someone who teaches on human trafficking, because that's the core of this offense. It's no longer treating people like people. It is exploiting them like they're things for your own profit or your own gain. And this jury got that. They got that this was a beautiful, amazing, perfect human being that was created in God's image that did not deserve to be treated this way. And they said, we will give a sentence that we believe says that across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that as well, right? During the trial, I remember that statement saying where Jessica said, you're pissing me off, right? Inside, I was like, of course, it makes sense. But on one hand, you could look at it and say, hey, this child has been somewhat hardened from this experience, right? She is calloused. She's got some wounds from this experience. But the innocence, the humanity, the beautifulness of Jessica truly came through. And I think all of us were able to see that. This is a child that has just been through such trauma, and yet she's still a beautiful human being that's got the capacity to get on that stand and to make sure that this justice is done. So, I remember the jury telling you that because I was back there. This was such a huge trial in our community.
San Antonio learned what human trafficking actually is through Jessica's cases, through both of them. And I think it shocked the conscience that we had people who were willing to do this and people who were willing to buy that it showed us. But I do think it shocked the conscience. The verdict was powerful. It really brought it home. It brought it home. And I have used it throughout the rest of my career to share it when it comes to human trafficking. Jessica even gave me permission to put it in the human trafficking investigation book that I have just recently published, because that concept that we gave life because she was worth it, that each individual life is worth our dedication, our work, our time, our investment, that flows. That's her legacy, in my opinion.
Well, it was important enough for the legislature then, the following two sessions, to look at it and to improve the language.
Yes.
Yeah, they're consistently improving that language.
Yeah.
So there have been really focuses on this type of charge and tightening up that language, which would enable prosecutors to have the opportunity to go after individuals that commit these kinds of crimes.
I was just going to ask Jessica, what do you remember from trial?
Trial was hard. I think the first trial, I would say, was the hardest for me, only because I remember I did not want to do it.
Yeah.
I remember telling myself, I'm done. I remember when we went on a break, I told Kirsta, I was like, I'm done. just take me back to detention. I don't want to be here no more. They're pissing me off. And she's like, no. And I was like, she's like, do you want it to happen to somebody else? I was like, no. So that was my main reason for staying.
The second trial, she was more relaxed, Judge. I don't know if you remember, but when they were crossing her the second time, they brought in this female defense attorney to ask Jessica questions, and she was kind of getting nowhere. And then she tried to convince Jessica that that the picture that Jessica had previously identified as the marijuana plants that were growing in the backyard were some sort of random native Texas plant that were not marijuana. And she kept bringing up the picture, and she would have Jessica look at the picture. Now, you're sure that that's not a native Texas da-da-da-da-da plant? Because if not, I do. She basically turned around and looked directly at the jury, and she said, I don't know a lot, but I know pot, and that's pot. And the jury bust out laughing. I was laughing. I don't know if you laughed, Judge, but everybody laughed in that courtroom. And that, again, swiftly closed the cross.
The first trial was tried by Maynard. I remember his last name. He was out of town. I don't really remember seeing too much of him since that trial. Human trafficking's become your forte. I mean, you've taken this experience.
Well, it's definitely my focus. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
That's a very important place to be. And I'm sure that you have done a lot to improve our community as it relates to those areas. So if there's an attorney that needs to consult, or a law enforcement agency, or a victim, or anybody who's got a need to reach out to somebody like
you can do an email to contact@justicestartsnow.org.
Mm-hmm.
Contact@justicestartsnow.org.
We've made some references to the Attorney General video, the film, Be the One.
Mm-hmm. And Be the One in the fight against trafficking. You can find it on the Attorney General's website. I think you can also find it on YouTube, but I'm not 100% positive about that.
Very good. And so that basically highlights this case, and then sort of the advocacy that has subsequently grown from that. How to handle these cases, how to identify them.
Well, it really focuses on helping everyone figure out how to identify trafficking and then how to report it. Because that's one of the big things. Jessica didn't come forward and say I was a victim of trafficking. She didn't know that she had been a victim of trafficking. And many times, most victims of trafficking do not self-identify. They're not calling the police. They're not asking for help. They do feel marginalized, oftentimes from the systems that are designed to help them. And so it's an important part of working on trafficking and actually bringing trafficking cases is a community that understands what trafficking is and is not, knows to look for certain red flags and ask questions, and then knows how to report trafficking, because oftentimes victims are not going to call for help. And so they end up being victimized for a much more significant period of time.
But Jessica, from your perspective, your experience, all that makes sense, I gather, right? All that, you find all that to be the case in your particular situation?
Yes, I think the only reason I did say something was because me and Eliseo, he had been my probation officer for, I think, already like a while, because I was on gang unit probation. So he had been my probation officer for a while, like I would say probably about a year.
Mm-hmm.
So me and him were really close. And I think that was the only reason I felt comfortable talking to him.
He was definitely a blessing. Well, I've enjoyed speaking to the two of you. Are there any last words that you would want our listeners to know about the experiences or the case or anything that you're doing now? I think it's really good, Jessica, as it relates to what your life has been like. I think it's really good for people to listen to you and to learn from you. I'm very proud of the fact that you've decided to advocate and to share your story, because, it's traumatic enough to recount certain things, but, you seem to have really grown. I mentioned to you right before we started recording, it's been a while since I've seen you. Your voice to me sounds clearly like the same person, but you've grown up some. How old are you now?
30. I just
30
turned
years.
30 last week.
You're making me feel like a much older man, I think. So is there anything that you would like our listeners to know? And happy belated birthday.
Just if anyone that has gone through what I've gone through that is listening, I know there may be times where you feel like there's no way out or there's no getting past it. There is. It's going to take a long time. I'm not saying I'm perfect and I'm completely over it because I'm not. I still have my moments. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still have certain triggers. But with counseling and with the support system that I have, I was able to get through it. And at one point, I never thought I would get through it, but I did. So I do want them to know that there is a way to get past it and there is a way to move forward with your life.
There's always hope, right?
Yes.
That's a very good message. What about you, Kirsta? What are your thoughts?
I think the last thing I would say is that people have value, no matter who they are, no matter where they've come from, what they've done, or what's been done to them. And when we start to live that way as a community, we will no longer have human trafficking, because that's at the core of this. It's remembering that people have value and living our lives in that way.
Well, thank you both for the messages, for the advocacy. Thank you very much for coming on to the show. I think it's always important that our listeners have a true understanding as to what happens within the system. And you bring a really unique, both of you, each of you bring a unique perspective to the issue of human trafficking and to these types of discussions. So thanks again. It's great to see both of you. I haven't seen either of you in quite a while. We've reached the end of this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Keep sending in those questions. We'd love to answer them. Remember that you can now text the show by clicking Text the Judge to send in your insights, your reviews, and your questions. I'll definitely mention them during the break. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks where we are educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.